I'm Fred McClimans, and on this edition of Perspectives, we're talking with Chris Heuer and Alan Berkson at PivotCon. Gentlemen?
Hey, Fred.
Thank you so much for having us here on your podcast today.
Chris, let's talk a little bit about social business and what it really means.
Oh, fantastic. You know, this is something I've been working on for several years now. Out of the birth of social media, what we wanted to do was explain the underlying effects to operations so that senior executives would look at how do they change or fundamentally transform their entire business to actually adopt some of these social principles to bring about more transparency, more connectivity, and ultimately to improve information flow. And we have a problem with it, and that's really a problem that social business is dead as a phrase, but the idea is just starting to take root. You know, when we started working on Social Media Club and promoting social media, we thought it was very important that we actually go with social media, not new media again, because we really wanted to represent what was different and what was new, and to focus on that characteristic of actually being social, because it was really this return to our humanity and our relationships and the connectivity between us. And more so that we really wanted to move away from the idea that social media was what we had for lunch. So in selling into the C-suite and elsewhere, we started working with social business as a primary term. And of course, IBM put a lot of marketing might behind it. And that's one of the reasons why I really got behind that, even though Dr. Eunice was using it for social enterprise and social business. But really, I don't think enough people really understand what we mean by it. And that's been one of the challenges, as we'll talk about more in a minute or so, I'm sure. But a real social business is one where the people are connected with each other, and they're also connected beyond their firewall with their partners, their distributors, their customers, the analysts, and the broader market at large, even sometimes including their competitors, which is a really unique idea.
An ecosystem approach.
Correct. And then underlying the connectivity is actually increasing the flow of information. Now then we apply our standard social media principles of authenticity and transparency to it, which is another element of accelerating information flow, just having the default position of sharing things, or as Tim O'Reilly said, the architecture of participation that requires this. But you know, what's been missing from that whole conversation so far is the other element that it creates, which is really what I'm working on now with my new company, which is the accountability component. And ultimately, when it's more transparent, you can see what everyone's doing, you have to be more accountable to it. You know, and that's the big problem that hit PR. PR now is accountable for delivering results, but they don't want to be because for years they didn't have to be. So anyways, that's a different subject. When we come back to the idea of social business, you know, it requires different mindset, different methodologies, and ultimately different measures for how you actually define that success.
What's the difference between trying to implement that within the enterprise versus customer facing?
So, you know, the thing is this, and I've got a piece coming out, and it'll be out perhaps by the time this gets up, that social business is dead, long live what's next. And it's not that the ideas behind it are dead, it's that the phrase hasn't caught on, and there's no budget behind it. Social media was forced upon most executives because customers demanded a response time in Twitter. And so all of a sudden their support departments have to gear up to respond in Twitter now, lest it become a PR disaster. So that forced PR to work with support. And it forced support to work with marketing because customer service is the new marketing, right? And so we started seeing this dotted line sort of collaboration, but ultimately the lines of reporting are still the same. So we still have really deep problems in the structures itself of how we work together.
Just like you say that, you know, what's next, or, you know, social media is just another channel, multi-channel, you know, in terms of support and adding on or any type of engagement. It's no longer multi-channel. It's just whatever it is. It's just marketing. It's not multi-channel marketing. It's not multi-channel support. It's just support.
Yeah, very true. So I'll definitely come back to omni-channel because I think that's really important, because from the beginning, CRM itself has been fundamentally flawed. The idea is actually that they want to get a 360-degree view of the customer. Well, that's total bullshit. What you need to provide is a 360-degree view of the company to the customer. So literally from the beginning, CRM has been ass backwards, or bass backwards, as they say, right? But really, the social media element of it, it was really forced on them by customers and forced on them by the pain that a PR disaster of a Dell hell might cause. Right. So having a poster child like that of the pain is what drives people to action. Most of the time, people don't pursue pleasure with the same gusto and energy that they avoid pain with. That's a Tony Robbinism that he's got from numerous other self-help personal development gurus. But what we see is that we haven't been able to find a poster child to say, these people kick ass at social business. There isn't one. You know, when I was asked about this when I was at Deloitte and I was working with, you know, high-end C-suite people, they'd ask me, like, name 5 of your clients that you've done this with successfully. Like, well, I don't have any because no one's spending the kind of money that's really going to take to transform their whole business. Now, as it turns out, I've since discovered the Morningstar Institute, which is actually, Morningstar itself, the food manufacturer, and they have the Morningstar Institute, which teaches self-management. That's a whole different organizational model that I think is more in line with what we mean by social business. But ultimately, you know, looking at who's successful, Ford's done perhaps the best job, because they're integrated in their innovation, in their customer support, in their product itself, across their marketing, across everything they do, even in their interactions with their dealers, partners, and advertisers, the way they do it, right? But even they are struggling, and they'll tell you that. I mean, you look at their Yammer implementation, they've done some great things, but they still haven't done everything they want to accomplish yet. And I think that's the problem. It's almost like I'm too liberal in my business talk, because I'll be honest about the nuances instead of just throwing out that bullshit banner headline like, oh, Ford is the best. They really are, but I see the other things they could be better. Exactly.
Right.
And so because we're willing to be honest about that, and I think that's true in social broadly, because this effect of transparency that we have, we know that if we make a statement like that, somebody somewhere is going to come along and go, oh, you forgot about that thing they screwed up, or whatever, and as a result, they don't grab it.
Yeah, there are no absolutes that you can latch onto.
What I end up with as really the bottom line is, what we've seen is spiky success. They're good at this part. They're good at Facebook marketing. They're good at being responsive to people. They're good at innovation, like Starbucks, my Starbucks idea, right? And that sort of thing. But then integrating it across the company, you're still trying to get a spread of a new mindset across a global enterprise that is pockets of different culture with different fiefdoms and different sense of who controls what, and information is power versus information is powerful. And just trying to get that mindset shift of tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of global employees takes a while, and it takes real vision. And I really haven't met any senior executive other than Alan Mulally who really has that sort of push and idea and insight.
I wanted to get back to what you said about the 360 view, and there's a friction, a dichotomy, in that businesses are trying to always get the lowest common denominator and simplify who their customer is, and yet with social, customers are learning that they want to be more individual and treated separately and treated distinctly, and that's a challenge because that's hard to scale, or it's hard to wrap your hands around it. Where do you see that going? And that's kind of what's next after social business, I think, or something like that.
Well, so look, let's be clear. You go back to John Hagel's work and many others, the web's real power is in the ability to create and sustain relationships. There's a guy I flew on a flight with back from Finland to New York who I wasn't feeling well, who interacted with the flight attendants for me, and it was only really 8-hour flight or whatever, and an hour we talked to each other, maybe 2. I still chat with him on Facebook every now and then, right? So we have this power to sustain relationships, and ultimately that's what the web's always been about. But everyone else has really been focusing on the transactional component of it. And so the personalization element, I think, is really important. You ultimately do have to look at the bottom line business in addition to the relationship. And the problem is it's like social media ROI. The impacts sometimes are not visible. I mean, you look at CEA, right? How long has CEA been doing consumer electronics? As far as I understand it, the last report I read in 2011, and I believe it's still the same today, they cannot track the impact of a positive customer review by Walt Mossberg in the Wall Street Journal to product sales. They see the lift, but they don't know how much of it they can attribute. Why? Because it's an open loop. It comes from anywhere, and people do transactions in separate systems. The same thing's true of social. But what it comes down to is we can measure some things. So while I was at Deloitte, what I came up with was what I call the engagement curve. And the idea was taking this concept of the experience curve, which was essentially the fundamental law in a manufacturing society of how do you create competitive differentiation and ultimately win the market. And what it basically stated was that if this year you're selling 100,000 units and they're costing you $100 a piece to make, if next year you can sell 1 million units and it costs you $40 a piece to make, you will gain a lot of experience that will create a competitive advantage, and that experience will let you sell in the market at a lower cost than your competitors, seize a greater number of market share, and ultimately, win the market. Now, in a connected society, I believe that the very fundamental social physics have changed. It's like the equivalent of the difference between a flat and a round world. All of a sudden, the world is round because we're connected, and we need to think about things differently. So that lever is no longer manufacturing units, although the principle still applies, it doesn't go away. But the differentiator now comes down to real relationships. And how many real relationships do we actually have in the market with customers, influencers, analysts, partners, and everyone else? Now, here's the thing. A real relationship, I mean like the relationship, I've known you for 7 years now online, and we've met several times in person, and I still know you, and we're friends, right? So that's easy. We have a real relationship. The switching cost of a high relationship is exceptionally high. It's like breaking up with an old girlfriend in college or a boyfriend in college. You stay in it because you know what it's like, and also because your identity is wrapped up in that relationship. Now, in influencer relationships, it's even more complicated now, because if I'm hanging out a lot with IBM, and IBM's flying me around the world, Hamburg and New York, and wining and dining me and letting me have access to CEO and everything else, I'd feel like I was cheating on them if I spent too much time with Mark Benioff promoting his stuff. There's literally this sort of sense of lock-in that you get, and the cost of switching is high for me, and it's higher for the company trying to win me. So if you don't seize the market leaders and influencers early and build those relationships, it's going to cost you an infinitely larger amount of money in order to win it later. One last point, which is this: real relationship is not just the simple statement of it, but it's an acronym describing its components. Because a real relationship is reciprocal, empathetic, authentic, and ultimately long-lasting. And so when you look at it in that sense, the more real relationships you have, the greater economic value you have, which is not just ROI, but it's ROR, as our good friend Ted Rubin will say, return on relationships. But that ROR for me is measured in not only capital and income, but it's measured in attention. How much time do they give me? Do they open my emails? Do they respond to my surveys? It's represented in the data that they give me through those surveys by opting into the loyalty programs and other things like that, sharing when we're doing things. And then ultimately the labor, whether it's giving them an idea through an innovation platform, sharing word of mouth, selling products for them, and then ultimately in the stories we tell about our experiences we have with them.
I think it's important for people to recognize that, as you describe the different type of relationships you have there, we have multiple relationships in real life, in person, person to person, just as we do with brands. But the reality is, every relationship is slightly different. Yeah. It almost goes back when we talked earlier about the 360-degree view. There's an element of transparency that we need to have in place there. Consumers need to have the same information depth and richness about vendors as vendors do about the consumers.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, and more to that point though, when you start understanding the value of the customer, it's no longer just customer lifetime value, it's customer plus network lifetime value. So you look at all these other factors as an element of that stuff, and ultimately to the original question Alan was asking was, people being treated differently. Ultimately, if your global service is on United, they will take you on a Mercedes from one plane to the next if you're changing planes and you're late. And the reason why is because you give them so much profitability every year by their loyalty and the number of transactions you do with them that they are going to invest more in you in return. So there are going to be some people who get better pricing, there are going to be people who get better service and everything else. And when some of the people who don't get the same quality of service hear that, they might be upset. But there's no reason why you can't have a rational conversation with them that says, look, this person gets this service because they spend $100,000 a year with us, on which we make $30,000 profit or whatever the margin is. But instead it's more like, oh, I'm so sorry, that's just how it is. That's like being told by your mom, why? Because I said so. Don't treat us like kids. Let's have a rational conversation with people. And if you can make the argument about why somebody gets better treatment than others, I think most people can understand that.
That comes down to the fundamental basis of a relationship, though. It has to be bidirectional.
Yes.
And it's one thing for a vendor or a brand to put, effort into the relationship, consumers also need to put something into that relationship. They can't expect to get everything all at once out of a brand. Unfortunately, it does not work that way.
So I'm a really big believer in a pyramid sort of approach. And in fact, when I look at the CNLTV model, what I have is we have a pyramid that's kind of usually a little flatter like this in terms of profitability per customer or economic value generated per customer. And then underneath, hopefully it's a really flat version with very few people underneath who are actually costing us money. And the whole idea is if you start looking at the other effects of attention, data, labor, and stories, that line will move. And so you end up with more people getting into programs where they're not necessarily handheld, but at least they have other perks and other opportunities that they wouldn't have if you're just looking at the transactional value anymore, but instead understanding the value of the real relationship and what that means to differentiate the business, because they're going to lead to 8 other customers this year through their word of mouth, or they're going to give you an insight. You know, the one that I always use is that green stir thing in Starbucks coffee. That was a My Starbucks idea submission. What if that guy was a Pete's customer and gave that idea to Pete's instead? I mean, that idea became a competitive differentiator for them winning commuter markets to prevent spillage as people drove to work with their coffee in their car. You wouldn't know that otherwise, but because that person loved the brand and was willing to share that idea with them, they actually got a massive competitive advantage.
So, Chris, if there was one thing that a brand could do to encourage their consumers to put more effort into that relationship from the consumer side, what would that be?
Well, you know, that's the problem. There's not just one thing it can do. I mean, look, the reality is that in most companies, the flow of information is bonked. And really that's what it's about. It's actually about, for me, it really, I guess I could come to one thing, which is actually develop a real information or signal or social media command center that can actually parse through all the noise, identify the signals, and route them to the most appropriate person to take action. And then from there, have a system in which people can look at the overall relationship and know that you're a Pittsburgh Pirates fan or whatever it is. So when the Pirates win the series, you know, how do we create rules that will then let the agents who have responsibility for the relationship or for the community or the market know to reach out to people and say, oh, I'll bet you that Alan's celebrating today, or whatever it might be, right? Or our good friend Sam, he can't get into the U.S. Oh, he's got to have problems with TSA again.
No, it's cloud score.
It is. You know, he couldn't get a job. Now he can't get in the USA. Cloud's in his depth, hasn't it?
Excellent. Chris, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Frank. Appreciate it.